Hello and welcome to another episode of At the Edge of It All. I'm Elena Gomez, and joining us again on the podcast is Justin Brooks. He's a professor of law here at the University of San Diego School of Law. Justin, thanks for being back.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So the first episode that we had you on, we talked a little bit about your background, how you got interested in law, and especially wrongful conviction cases, which you spent your entire career working on. You were the founding director of the California Innocence Project, where you worked on wrongful conviction cases and actually helped to free 40 people from prison. So an incredible journey in your career. And today we want to talk more so about wrongful conviction cases, but also about a new clinic here at the University of San Diego School of Law, the Innocence Clinic. Those will be working on wrongful conviction cases alongside the Innocence Center. So we're going to dive into that in a little bit. But before we get into that, I want to kind of understand the landscape of wrongful conviction cases. What does it look like today? Has it improved, or just what are we seeing in terms of cases where people are innocent and in prison?
Well, we haven't solved the problem. Let's start with that there's still innocent people in prison and there's still innocent people going to prison. You know, there's no such thing as a perfect criminal legal system in the world. Even when we set it up, when we say people have to be convicted beyond a reasonable doubt, we don't say 100%. And so there's always going to be a crack. It's just, how big is that? So over the work that I've been doing for the past 30 years, I've seen a lot of improvements. We do better at doing identification procedures now. We now record confessions in a lot of jurisdictions, so we know exactly what was said. So we've been coming up with remedies that have improved the processes. But we're still seeing large numbers of people coming out of prison who are innocent. So it's hard to say if the number going in is any better. We know more people are coming out, but I also know that when I started this work, there were only 6 or 7 lawyers in the country that were doing this. And now we've got hundreds of people working in projects all over the United States. So that's why I think we've seen so much of an increase of people being released from prison.
Yeah, no, that is incredible. Not just here in California, but everywhere. There, like you said, in different communities, people are working on these cases because it is such an issue.
We've got 66 projects in the United States. We've got a network of projects in Europe. We have a network of projects in Asia. We have projects in Australia. We have projects all over the world because, again, there's no such thing as a perfect system. I mean, our project in Amsterdam has freed a bunch of people. And I always say, you know, if they're wrongfully convicting people in Northern Europe, where they have much better criminal legal systems, they're happening everywhere.
What seems to be in your work seems to be some similar through lines with cases that you've worked on. Is there similarities? Are all of them, I mean, every case is different, right? But are there through lines that you see that are common issues that pop up time and time again for what led that individual to be wrongfully convicted?
Absolutely. In fact, that's the topic of my book, You Might Go to Prison Even Though You're Innocent. The original title was Top 10 Reasons You Might Go to Prison Even Though You're Innocent, because I kind of identified 10 of what I thought and still think are the leading causes of wrongful conviction. So they run the full gamut from things that like bad identifications, which I think might be the leading cause in the world because everybody has problems with memory. Everywhere there's problems with police procedures on how they do identifications. And juries really put a lot of weight into an ID. You know, someone comes to court and says, I'm 100% sure that's the person. They will convict on that alone with no other evidence. In fact, I saw that with one of my clients. He was working on the line in a factory at the time of this shooting. There was nothing connecting him to the crime whatsoever. No physical evidence, no statements, nothing. And just the identification by a white woman, and he was a Latino guy, of a photo taken when he was a teenager, and he was almost 30 at the time of the crime. On her identification alone, he was sent to prison. And ultimately, we proved he was actually working at this factory at the time. So identification is a big one. False confessions is a big one. And recording of confessions is improving that. But then there's things like, I have a chapter in my book called You Live in the Country or You Live in the City, because both of them are bad in terms of wrongful convictions. In the city, there's over-policing that often leads to wrongful convictions, like rounding up groups of kids where a few of them might be dealing drugs, but other ones might just be hanging out on that street corner or might live there. And then the under-policing that occurs in rural areas where they don't understand how to process crime scenes often leads to wrongful convictions. So there's a whole lot of reasons, things to do with race and poverty, bad science, lots of reasons. But you're absolutely right that there are common themes that if you work in this field long enough, you start reading a case and you just say, oh, okay, that's another one of those, because they start looking the same in terms of the mistakes that are made.
And what is the process for someone that goes to prison? Maybe a jury decided that they felt that person was guilty of that crime. They go to prison. I imagine it's very hard to flip to get out of that and prove again, no, I am innocent. What is the process of that? And I'm sure in your time, I know in the last podcast, you shared that you spent decades on a case for someone, right? So what is the process on the other end for attorneys like yourself, lawyers like yourself that are trying to fix these wrongs?
Yeah, I spent nearly 30 years to exonerate a woman. I started working on the case when I was 29 years old and finished it when I was in my late 50s. So it's not easy. To unring the bell of a conviction in this country is incredibly difficult. So at trial, the prosecution has the burden of proving that you're guilty. But once you're convicted, now you have the burden of proving that you're innocent. And unless you can get really compelling evidence that will overwhelm that prosecution's case, you're not getting out of prison. So that's why we see so many exonerations, for example, in DNA cases, because DNA is like the greatest forensic science in history, where you can say, look, there's 1 in a billion chances that I committed this crime based on DNA. But other times, what we've seen after seeing a lot of DNA cases is the courts have started to open up their minds to other cases where there may not be DNA, but it has all the same problems, like a potential bad identification, a potential false confession, potential statement by a snitch in prison. And the courts are realizing that a lot of those snitches are just making up things to say. So we've seen that greatly improve over the years. But there's still a long way to go with that.
What else do you think needs to happen? I think the recording, when did they start recording that, where they were your confessions? When were they started? Is that recent?
So they still haven't done it in every jurisdiction in the United States. It is recent, a mandatory recording. In some jurisdictions, they'll say mandatory recording in homicide investigations. But for example, right now, one of the battles we're fighting is whether the police can lie to you during an interrogation. And in California, we got a law passed that says they can't lie to juveniles, but they can still lie to adults. And so even sometimes when you're recording it, some of the techniques that they use will get people to confess to things they didn't do. One example of that is this case, Marty Tankloff in New York, where he wakes up one morning. He's 17 years old. Both his parents have been stabbed to death in their beds. And the police actually fabricated a call from Marty's dad, pretending his dad called and said, Marty stabbed me. Marty's the one who did it. And then he starts thinking, maybe I did. Maybe I was sleepwalking. And here's a traumatized 17-year-old kid whose parents have just been killed. And they took advantage of that mental state and convinced him. And he went to prison for 20 years. He got out. He's now a criminal defense lawyer in Manhattan. So even someone as bright as Marty can get sucked into that. So I think we need multi-layers of reform, because the police are trained. They use this thing called the Reed technique. And the Reed technique is not about getting the truth. It's about getting the suspect to agree to the narrative that the police already have. So it's the difference between convincing someone of something and trying to get the truth out of them. And after 13 or 14 hours of interrogation, people often just get worn down, tired, or they're thinking, it doesn't matter what I say at this point. I just need to get out of this room. And they sign things they shouldn't sign. So we really need to attack this from all angles. And sometimes even, just recording interrogations isn't enough. Innocent people will still slip through that.
Yeah, it's a step. But like you're saying, there has to be sort of more protections in place for people, because law in itself is something people go to school for many years for, and to practice it and to understand it. And it's hard to understand all those legalities. And if you're caught in that situation where someone is telling you something or you don't understand your complete rights, you get lost in all of that. And so you really need to there needs to be more protections, maybe like you're saying, in place to help people. Kind of recording them is one thing, but other things need to happen to make sure people are protected.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people think they know their rights until they get in kind of the pressure situation with 3 or 4 homicide detectives telling them things like, well, if you cooperate now, things will go easier on you. And even though they have no power to make things go easier on you, I think people don't really appreciate that there's this policing process and then there's a prosecution process. And the prosecutor has all the power ultimately. It doesn't matter what the police say to you in terms of cooperation. They're going to decide whether you get prosecuted or not. And so I think there's knowing your rights and then being confident in asserting your rights, which are kind of 2 different things. And I think no matter how many TV shows you watch about policing, I still see people cooperating in ways they never should have. My best advice is to politely decline a search, politely decline to answer questions. Don't have to be aggressive about it. You don't have to be hostile about it. Just decline.
Yeah. Well, there's still so much work to be done on wrongful conviction cases, and that is a large reason why now at the University of San Diego, in the next few months, they'll be opening the Innocence Clinic. You'll be leading the Innocence Clinic, and this is great because really what it is it's law students here at the University of San Diego that are working with the clients in real time on these cases. You supervise them. This is an opportunity to work with real cases and get that hands-on experience that students need. Tell me a little bit about the Innocence Clinic and what you're hoping for with this.
Yeah, so the whole reason I got into this work 30 years ago was when I took on this death penalty case in Chicago. I told my students, I was teaching criminal law at the time in Michigan, and I said to my class of students, there's this woman sitting on death row. She says she's innocent. Who wants to help me out? And 4 kids raised their hands. And I said, okay, come over to my house tonight in East Lansing. We'll sit at my kitchen table. We'll start looking at the case. And we did. And then that weekend, I put them all in my Jeep and we drove to Chicago and we went to the crime scene and started figuring out, where was the witness standing? What did she see? And I realized working on that case 2 things. Number one, there are innocent people in prison who need help. And I was shocked that people could be on death row. Back then, I was shocked. I was in my 20s and have had no due process and were innocent. But the second thing I learned was the best way to teach someone to be a great lawyer is to do the actual work. It's a skill profession that involves certain skills. It's not about sitting in a room and reading books. And to be a great criminal lawyer, you have to know how to go to crime scenes. You have to know how to talk to people. You have to know how to manage clients. You have to know how to go to an evidence room and figure out how to get the evidence. They're all practical skills. It's like you can't learn to be a plumber by reading a book about plumbing. You got to turn a wrench. You got to know exactly how much...
That hands-on experience, yeah.
Exactly. You got to know exactly how much weight to put on that wrench before you break that drain pipe. So, and I always compare this to medical school because forever we've recognized that they don't let people out of medical school unless they've worked with real patients. Because nobody wants to go to a doctor and the doctor say, you're my first patient.
Right.
You're out of there when you hear that. It's the same thing for lawyers. No one wants to go to a lawyer and a lawyer say, you're my first client. All I've been doing is reading about this law stuff in school. And so the idea of the clinic is that there's this tremendous need that innocent people get helped, and that's what we're going to do. And there's a tremendous need for these law students to get practical experience. So we're going to work alongside the Innocence Center, which is a innocence organization here in San Diego that I helped set up and I'm on the board of. And we're going to have their lawyers working with us and working on their cases in conjunction with the law students at the law school. And these students are going to get the experience of going to prison and talking to clients, of investigating cases, of working on briefs and motions, and hopefully going to court with some of these lawyers to get people out of prison who are innocent.
Do you see some of these cases being passed on? Because like you said, you spent decades on one case. Do you think some of these cases might be handed off from student to student before the person is freed, or how do you see that evolving?
Yes. Sadly, the first 3 or 4 years I ran the California Innocence Project, my students didn't get to see the end of cases at all. And then we started getting people out. And what I started doing was kind of spreading it out so that students would get to experience a case at the end and a case at the beginning. So a lot of times they'll just be going through cases that are just coming in the door and you're starting an investigation. And other times they might be going to court to see those people walk out. So hopefully there'll at least be 2, 3, or 4 of those exonerations happening every year, and students can be a part of that. But there'll certainly be a lot of initial work of screening cases, figuring out whether it's a case worth pursuing, and then presenting memos to lawyers, doing presentations on the facts of the case. Because a big part of innocence work is actually screening through the haystack looking for the needle. And it's not that a lot of people, there's of course some people who write in who were guilty. But the sad thing is a lot of people seek help and they're innocent, but there's just no way to prove it. And that's the hardest part about the work, is closing the cases when you're thinking this person very well could be innocent, but there's no way we're going to have the evidence to prove their innocence.
Yeah. What does it mean to be working with the Innocence Center here in San Diego, to actually have that partnership with an organization outside of USD's walls?
So it's exciting for me because the Innocence Center is basically made up of all my former lawyers from the California Innocence Project. And actually, they're pretty much all my former students. So they were students that then I hired as lawyers and trained. And now they've created what's going to be more and more national organization of working in areas of the country where there aren't innocence organizations, and then working specifically in Southern California. So I'm excited to pair up with my old friends again on this project. And I think I keep telling them they're going to love the students at University of San Diego School of Law. I love my students here. They're enthusiastic, they're smart, and they really want this experience.
And for the students, I mean, it seems like yourself, you brought on some students back then when you first started on that one case. You're saying you have former students at the Innocence Center. I imagine that when you do the work and you see the people and you see how the system is kind of laid out for them, and you're trying to prove innocence, but it's difficult with all of the judicial barriers in place, I imagine it changes these students. And it changes them to maybe look at the legal system a little bit differently, or maybe change the trajectory of where they were possibly going in law school, right? What do you envision with that?
All of that. And I experienced that in law school. I went to law school to be a corporate lawyer. I did my undergraduate degree in finance and business, and I did master's MBA classes. And I went to law school thinking I'm going to be a corporate guy. And then my first year criminal law professor took us to a prison. The next thing you know, I was teaching in a prison. And then my whole career went in the direction of criminal law. So I've seen some students do it and they think this is all I want to do the rest of my life. Occasionally there's students who do it and they think I absolutely don't want to do this because it takes an emotional toll and it's not for them. And that's great too, because you should experience different things. I've also seen a real interesting thing of how it impacts how they see the world, in both philosophically in terms of the criminal legal system and seeing its faults, but also a lot of times they look at their own life and appreciate it so much more and start complaining a lot less about their hardships, like taking exams and writing papers, when they're driving out to a prison and seeing someone in, the worst surrealistic nightmare you could be in, being innocent and in prison. So it has a deep impact. And I'm still friends with so many of my students over the last 30 years that I still see and talk to regularly. I like to go hang out at the bar downtown where all my students who are now public defenders all go after work. There's a real community spirit around this kind of work.
And what's great about the legal clinics too, and what the Innocence Clinic will do, is it's free legal support. And legal support is expensive. And for people maybe that have been dealing with a wrongful conviction case maybe for years, decades, that's expensive for those families fighting for their loved one to get out of prison. How big of a help is it to get free legal support in these cases when it's so needed?
Yeah, I mean, just to give you an example, on one case I worked on, I remember we spent over $100,000 just on expenses that had nothing to do with lawyer hours.
Wow.
So the legal work is free. And that's why students are such a miracle, because they work for free. They work for credit. The lawyering is free. And then I've been for the last 25, 30 years raising money to fund the rest of it, which is expert witnesses, travel money, gas money, having my students stop at McDonald's for lunch. Sometimes we'll have hearings out in the desert that last for weeks and you have to stay in a hotel. And so typically in a year with the California Innocence Project, I'd raise $1 million of funding to cover expenses. And that's with all the legal help being free. So it's very, very expensive to do this work. And, all the innocence organizations, to be an innocence organization, you have to be providing pro bono legal services. And that's been part of our movement for the last 30 years and continues.
Wonderful. And so where can people find you? I think the Innocence Clinic will be opening in January, correct?
Yeah, they're going to start up in January. People can go to theinnocencecenter.org to see the work the Innocence Center is doing. And of course, you can find me on the University of San Diego websites, and I'm on every social media ranting on a daily basis.
Perfect. And we can put in a link in for now for the USD legal clinics too, so people can check those out and get that information. Well, Justin, thanks so much for being back with us. This was great.
Pleasure as always.
And if you like this episode, be sure to subscribe to catch our next one.